Hey guys, welcome to the Code with Jason Meetup. This session is the first Code with Jason Meetup Europe edition. So I started doing a 9 a.m. Eastern time on Sundays, which is 1 p.m. GMT. On this first one, we have a modest attendance level. We have 3 people plus myself. And today we're going to talk about testing. And I was planning to talk about something else, but we're going to talk about, whoa, I don't know if you guys heard that, but there's like a big rumble behind me. I'm in a barn. Maybe there was an animal or something. Anyway, my office is actually located inside of a barn. You probably can't tell by looking at it, but that's where it is. Anyway, I had a different topic idea for today, and instead I'm going to talk about testing because I think that's better for this group. So here's how I'll start. I'm currently going through the process of rewriting my book. My existing book is called The Complete Guide to Rails Testing. It's an ebook. This new book I'm writing, it's going to be a print book. In fact, I have a proof coming from Amazon to my house right now. It's supposed to arrive in just a couple days of a hardcover version of my book. So I'm making a print version, and I'm also going to go through and basically rewrite the entire book from scratch. And the reason for this is because in the time since I wrote this book, which is maybe a couple of years now, I've learned a lot more about how to teach testing. And so I want to teach some things that I haven't taught. There's some things that I think I should be teaching that I haven't been teaching in the past. This is actually the second time that I'm completely rewriting my book. And so I want to have kind of a conversation and give kind of a lecture, but not just a lecture, but hopefully it's kind of interactive. And I'm going to ask you guys questions throughout this. And the first question I want to ask you guys is, one, how long have you been programming? And I know that we talked like a bit pre-recording about this, but one, how long have you guys been programming? And two, how long have you been learning testing? So if you guys can tell me a little bit about that. Anthony, is it okay if we start with you?
Yeah, that's fine.
Mm-hmm.
So I started learning programming from a boot camp here in Berlin in 2019. So going on 3 years now. Been working, they don't really teach us a lot of testing in that. So when I got my first job, that's when I really dig deep into RSpec tests for our monolith application that I had at my first company. Yeah, so I wouldn't say I'm the best at testing. It takes me longer to write the test than it does to write the feature.
Mm-hmm.
But well, I definitely want to get better and more proficient at it. So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. It helps. And Sanjeet, how about you?
So Rails specifically, I've been doing it for 3 months and that sort of time. But other software testing has been, because I've been writing code almost 25 years. So yeah.
Okay. And how about with automated testing specifically?
None at all.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And Bishoy, how about you?
I created side projects before, and for the testing part, it is always after you create the features, not before. So I didn't try, like, I tried this before, but just once, like to write test-driven development and write the test cases before create the feature. But in the work, I have never did this.
Okay. Okay. So there's something I want to share with you guys. So some time ago, it was maybe like a year or so ago, I did a round of interviews. The place I worked, we were trying to hire some developers, and I was interviewing candidates. And the way I would do this was I would give people a live coding exercise. They had to program the game Hangman, if you guys know Hangman. And I didn't require people to like get all the way done. I told them that I just wanted to watch them approach the problem. I wanted to watch them code a little bit. And I interviewed, maybe 15 people or so. And out of those 15, I would say maybe 3 or 4 performed in a way that I would call a pass. And the rest of the people just totally, like the people who passed, I would give them like an A or a B. Everybody else I would give an F. Like it was a stark difference. Like the people who did good did really good, and the people who did bad just, they never got anything working at all. And the people who failed all failed in the same way, and the people who succeeded all succeeded in the same way, which I found interesting. I'll tell you the workflow for the people who failed. They gained an understanding of the requirements, and then they started writing code. And they wrote maybe 10 or 15 lines of code, and they would spend most of the available time just writing code. They would never run it. And then near the end, once they had a lot of code written, they would try to run their program for the first time. And unsurprisingly to me, it wouldn't work. They would get some error message or something like that. And then they would look at the error message and be like, oh no, what could be wrong? And they would sit there and think for a bit, and then they would like try to change something, and then they'd run it again. Maybe they just get the same error again or a different error. And it was just very haphazard, not methodical at all. They were doing a lot of trial and error. So that's the people who failed. The people who succeeded worked in a different way. They would gain an understanding of the requirements, so same first step. But then instead of writing a lot of code, they would write like one line of code. For example, this program had to read from a file. And so maybe they would write a line that reads from the file and just outputs the entire file contents. And then they said, okay, I have the file IO working. And, maybe it wouldn't work. Maybe they would try to output the file contents, but they made a syntax error or something. So they would see the error, and then they would correct it. And obviously that was easy because they'd only written one line of code. There was no mystery as to where the error was. Once they'd done that, they would write one more line of code, run that, see if it worked. If it worked, they would write another line of code, and they would follow this process until all of requirements were fulfilled, or until we ran out of time. And so all the people who were successful in that same way. By the way, we had a new person join. Neil, welcome, Neil. Side note, we had a certain topic for today. We're going to talk about Rails models. I decided to change and talk about a testing topic instead. So just so you're not confused, I wanted to explain that. Okay, anyway, these people are interviewed. Again, the people who failed all failed in the same way. The people who succeeded all succeeded in the same way. And this way of working that the successful people used, I call this feedback loops. So again, write a line of code, run it, see what happens. If a correction needs to be made, fix it. You're getting feedback from that line of code. And there's a little bit more to the feedback loop that I didn't explain. When you're writing a line of code, obviously you're not just writing something random. You have a certain objective in mind. So first, I'll speak for myself. If I were gonna write a program like this, I would gain an understanding of the requirements. And then I would maybe pick out one of the requirements to tackle first. And I would express it in terms of a test, not an automated test. I don't mean the kind of test you write. I just mean a test that you perform. So I would say, okay, let's take this file reading example. I would say my objective that I want to fulfill right now is I want to read from this file and output the contents to the screen. And the test that I'm going to perform is I'm going to run my program, and I'm going to assert that the contents of the file appear on the screen. So again, it's not an automated test, it's a manual test. But I have this test in mind before I do anything. So I have this test in mind. Then I write my line. Oh, by the way, first, very important. First, I would perform my test and make sure that it doesn't pass. And the reason for that is to protect against a false positive. Because if you conceive of a test and then you perform it and your test passes, you can't know whether your test passed because your application is behaving properly, or if it's, hang on, let me say it a different way. You can't know if your test passes because of the code you just added, the change you just made, or if you actually conceived of an invalid test and that test would have passed before your change anyway. So you need that way to be sure that your change is what's making the test pass. So for that reason, you conceive of the test, perform the test, observe that the test fails, again, to ensure the validity of your test. And then make your change, run your test again. So in this case of reading from a file, my first action I would take would be to run that test. So to run that test, I would execute my program and just observe that there's no output. So that's my failing test. Once I observe that there's no output, I would add my line that says file.read, blah, 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 whatever. I would run that. And then I would see, what do I get now? Do the contents of the file appear on the screen? Because that's what my test asserts. Again, this is a manual test, not an automated test. And if that test fails, then of course I would make the necessary change that I think it would take to make it pass. And if the test passes, then no more action is needed, and that loop is complete. So again, this is the feedback loop method of programming. There's no automated testing involved. It's all manual tests, but it's a methodical way of programming. You can obviously see the difference between doing it this way and writing like 20 lines of code and then trying to run it and seeing that it doesn't work and then trying to figure out what went wrong. The reason I bring up all this is because it's rarely explained this way. In fact, I've never heard it explained this way, but the feedback loop workflow that I just explained is test-driven development. In this case, it happens to be manual test-driven development because there's no automated tests involved, but it's still test-driven development. And then the only difference between this way of working in feedback loops and real test-driven development with automated tests is that you're automating the feedback loop process. So I wanted to explain that in that way because I've never heard it explained that way by anybody anywhere, but I think that's a bit of an easier way to understand what test-driven development is all about than most of the explanations I see. I want to pause there and see if anybody has any comments or questions or anything like that.
You know what, Jason, I would agree with that because I was responsible for my own bit of code, without anybody else testing that in my, work, my role at work. And that's exactly what I used to do. Even if it is a small piece of work, do that little bit of testing, then only move on rather than leaving all the testing to the end. Absolutely. Now, will you say that, with test-driven development, it sort of is the scope is always around that unit testing as opposed to anything else? Would you say that?
That's a great question. I would say no. And in fact, there's a lot more to the automated testing workflow, test-driven development workflow, than just the writing test itself. And I found this with my consulting clients. And not just my consulting clients, but other developers I've observed over the years and stuff like that. A lot of people have a tendency to jump right in and start writing code prematurely. People I've come up with this I don't know, one sentence piece of advice, which is decide what you're going to do before you start doing it, which sounds like obvious, but a lot
Yes.
of people, they just start doing it before they've decided what they're going to do. And if I were to stop them and say, hey, wait a second, what are we doing right now? They would say, oh, not sure.
Yeah, it's that pitfall of design as you code, isn't it? Yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah, and there's two things, and I've talked about this other places too, which is there's the what and there's the how. And I think it's okay to figure out the how as you go, but you want some degree of figuring out what you're going to do beforehand. So here's what I think is like necessary as part of a successful TDD workflow. First, you have some kind of high level objective. Maybe we'll keep going with this hangman example. So the high level objective in this case is to make the game Hangman. We're going to make like a command line program where you can play Hangman. And then from that, of course, that's too big to be like tractable. So you have to break off a piece and work on that. So maybe the first objective is to be able to take a word. Sorry, somebody else joined. You have to be able to take a word and convert that word into blanks. So if the word is Jason, we need to be able to show 5 blanks so that the person can guess that word. And then once you have that objective established, you can start working on it. And that's kind of maybe not the greatest example. But my point is that when you're building a feature, something I go through with my consulting clients is to have them write down what they want to accomplish. I think the best way to do this is in some form of a ticket. But like just writing it in a text format is fine. But just write like the overall objective, and then if that's too big, write the smaller pieces that go into that. And I have people write this not in terms of what they need to do, but in terms of the result they want. So don't write how you think you're going to accomplish it. Just write what you want to end up with at the end. And I'm going to come back, Sanjit, and answer your question about unit tests versus other kinds of tests. A lot of times for a feature, you don't know what the really fine-grained steps are going to be to accomplish this. Maybe you know what the UI is going to look like, but you don't know exactly how everything's going to work. And so I often follow something called outside-in testing. And I learned this from a book called Growing Object-Oriented Applications Guided by Tests. Outside-in testing is when you start with like an end-to-end test, and you start with a failing end-to-end test, and then you drop down a level and do the feedback loop cycle with unit tests, and then you come back out and make the end-to-end test pass. So that's often how I'll do that. So my answer is no, it's not just unit tests. I follow the TDD process with end-to-end tests also.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for explaining.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions or comments from you guys, Anthony or Bishoy? You guys good for now? Okay. Yeah, so that's something that I really wanted to cover, is that feedback loop programming process. Again, the tests are all manual. And then once you kind of understand that, TDD is nothing more than the automated version of that. I think a lot of people get hung up on tools when they're trying to learn testing, and that's obviously a necessary part of it. But if all you know is the tools, you're not going to be successful with it. You're not going to have good outcomes, is maybe how I'd put it. Because I've come across test suites where people know the tools, but they don't have the methodology. They don't even understand why they're writing tests. And And so they end up with a test suite and they have maybe a lot of tests, but their tests are actually kind of pointless and they're not really testing anything that makes sense. So I would advise, don't start with the tools, start with that feedback loop workflow. And once you feel like you really understand that and you've committed it to memory and it feels natural for you to work in that way, and maybe you already do work in that way, but once you have that down, then I would advise trying to move from manual tests to automated tests for your feedback loop workflow. Okay, this is kind of an impromptu. Everything I've done so far has been just like off the top of my head. And we could go in any number of directions now. But maybe we could just open it up for some general Q&A. First of all, do you guys have any general questions about testing? And I'll give you guys a little bit to think about that. And my other question for you is, to what degree, what's your comfort level right now? If I said to you, for example, build the game Hangman and do it in a TDD style, do you feel like you'd be able to do that now? And if not, what do you feel like is missing from your skill set that you wouldn't be able to do that? So anyway, I'll turn it over to you guys. Do you have any general questions about testing? And my other question is, like, how do you feel with do you feel like you're able to do a TDD workflow now, or do you feel like something is missing from your skill set right now? If so, what do you think it is? I'm trying to figure out where to go next with the discussion. So Anthony, do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, more of a generalized comment, not specifically to testing, but around there.
Mhm.
So, like, the companies that I've worked for so far have been very adamant against commenting in their code for clarity and explanation, and to rely on the RSpec tests to be the decoder of what the features or what the file should be doing. I find that a little bit more difficult than leaving comments in the code, especially if it's an abstract, like if it's written by somebody who's been programming for 5, 6, 7 years in Ruby, me coming into a brand new repo, trying to understand it based on the RSpec tests when my RSpec skills aren't up to snuff or, aren't that great yet. What is the comfort level that you think most people joining a new company should have, or what companies need to be doing more to onboard people with less experience in that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. Regarding the comments, I think that their view is a bit overly simplistic, because I think it's good to have comments not for what, but for why. So like I've seen some really poor commenting practices. The funniest one I've ever seen was there was a return statement and somebody had a comment above that just said return. It's like, yeah, no shit. So I don't think those comments are good that like explain what the code does, but I do think it's a good idea to have comments that explain why things are the way they are if there's no way to gain that understanding from the code. So I think to the degree possible, the code should be self-explanatory. And I think when people find themselves wanting to add a comment to explain things, they should instead ask themselves how they can structure the code to be more self-explanatory. But I don't think it's smart to have a rule that says like no comments ever, because sometimes it does make sense, but it's a little bit of a subjective thing. How much does that speak to your question, or did you have a question about something a little bit different also?
Well, I mean, that answers a bit of it. Because, like, for instance, one of the things that I had to implement recently was one of our partner APIs needs to have a date format in Unix UTC, so a long string of milliseconds, and that's nowhere. You're not going to find that in commented why we are converting something to one form or another in dates in the RSpec tests.
Mm-hmm.
But in the future, if we need to change that, or if the requirements from the API change, we don't know why it was there to begin with if I'm not there at the company to explain it. So, I mean, it's kind of those that kind of ties into both the testing methodology of, do we write the test and say it expects this because carrier, or like what would be the better way to convey that type of stuff, that type of information to less experienced testers to be able to decipher things that are more obscure that you can't refactor in a certain way.
Yeah, I certainly wouldn't hesitate to add an explanatory comment in that case, because it's like, how else are you going to know? One other idea that I might entertain is like, you could have somewhere in the code, like you could refer to, you could have something called like the desired format of such and such API. Like the function name could be called convert to format for the API name. But as I'm saying that out loud, I don't feel like I love that idea. It seems like a comment would be better in that case. So yeah, the like no comments ever idea and put it in the test instead, that seems like too inflexible and like overly dogmatic. I don't think I would subscribe to that way of thinking.
Yeah, that makes sense to me too. I just, being so new to things, I'm like, is this common practice across multiple companies? Like, because I've only worked for 2 companies now, and it's been both of them have that type of methodology. So it was just getting my mind thinking of like, maybe it's a German thing. I don't know.
Yeah, something to be aware of, and this is kind of unfortunate, something to be aware of as you're learning testing and even programming in general, is a lot of things that you're taught are just plain wrong. Like there's a lot of testing advice out there that's just wrong. And this is interesting. We were talking about ChatGPT before the recording started. I've asked ChatGPT to write tests for me for certain things, and it writes tests in the specific cases that I tried. It would write tests in a way that was like really totally pointless. But the tests were written in a pointless way, but the tests kind of matched like the prevailing wisdom out there regarding how you should write tests. Like you could tell that ChatGPT seemed to learn from like reading tutorials about testing and stuff like that. And then it just followed what it was taught. But what it was taught was actually bad. And so you might...
Sorry, Jason,
Yeah.
was it, it was good at telling you what, but was not good at the how?
Well, I can tell you,
I
can tell you the way it wrote them. So, well, here's an example. Like I was taught early on with testing that every method should have a test. And so like I would write tests like oriented around the methods in my classes. But that's actually like, that's not a very good way to do it, because for one, then your tests get really tightly coupled to your implementation. And so then if you change how the class works, then you have to change all your tests too. And the other is because, and this is a bigger reason, because like your methods aren't really the point. The point is the behavior of your tests. So my advice to people is, don't think of it as I want to write tests for all my methods. Think of it as I want to write tests for all my behaviors. And again, if you're looking at a test that's oriented around methods, you might not be able to infer the big picture from the tests. Whereas if your tests are oriented around behaviors, it's a lot easier to see the big picture. And then again, there's the added benefit of, if your tests are oriented around behavior and not so tightly coupled to the specific methods in the class, then you're free to refactor your class in a way that still meets the behavior that's specified by the test, but is structured in a different way. And that's one of the big points of testing in the first place, is to allow safe refactoring in a way where you can be confident that you're still meeting the behaviors. And I don't know if that's what you meant, Sanjeev, but that's my thought on that.
Sort of more like, be bothered about the public interface and not the inner workings.
That is sort of what you're saying, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. And as a side note, a question that comes up a lot is, should I test private methods? And my answer is yes. You should test the behavior that's in the private methods, but not directly. You should test that behavior through the public interface, like what you're saying.
Ah, okay, understood.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else on that topic or any other questions?
Well, that leads me into one of the RSpec testing is, so if you're testing the behavior of private methods through the public interface, is that still qualified or described as a unit test, or is that more of a feature functional test?
Yeah.
I
This
thought
is-
about this
Mhm.
also.
Uh-huh.
Think of it.
So something that I heard JB Rainsberger say, and if you guys aren't familiar with JB Rainsberger, I having trouble talking this morning. I highly recommend his stuff. He pointed out that nobody agrees on what a unit is. And that was really helpful for me to hear, because you hear these things, and again, you develop this idea. It's easy to think that these people are giving you authoritative wisdom, and these things they're saying are correct because it's in a book or something like that. And so you come to think that unit testing must mean something specific. But no, it doesn't mean something specific. I mean, kind of specific, but not that precise. Because again, nobody agrees on what a unit is. So there are unit testing purists who will say that, oh, if it's a unit test, it can't talk to the database or these other things. And if it doesn't meet these criteria, then it's not a unit test. But there's not a universal consensus on what a unit test is. So when people talk about these things, there's no like single authoritative answer. I don't know how much that answers your question, but when you say unit tests, that's a term that has kind of a fuzzy meaning. But in saying all this, I've kind of forgotten the original question.
Yeah, it was more about just basically what is a unit test? If it's testing a behavior versus individual components of the behavior. I guess that's something that's more defined on a group level within the organization that would need to decide that type of definition.
Well, here's what I'll say about that. I can tell you how I personally think about it. And I know I'm not alone in this. A lot of other people think about it the same way. So for me, an end-to-end test or system test, again, this terminology is a bit fuzzy. People use different terms for the same thing, and they use the same terms to mean different things. There's no consensus on terminology, but I'll say system test. A system test is one that exercises the full stack. The test is spinning up a browser, it's clicking on UI elements, asserting for things on the page, is these very high level tests. Those are system tests. Some people call them end-to-end tests. And then at a finer grain from that, you have what you could call unit tests. And in Rails, you have model tests or model specs. I don't have a problem with referring to those as unit tests. And those are the tests where instead of exercising the UI, they exercise individual classes and methods and stuff like that. And so for me, I'll get into the really fine-grained behavior there. For my system tests, I'll have a relatively small number of coarse-grained tests. And for my model tests, I'll have a relatively large number of fine-grained tests. For the system tests, I'll usually just test the happy path, or maybe the happy path in one exceptional case or something like that. But for the model tests, I will hit all the permutations. The reason I do it that way is because it'd be wasteful in the system tests to try to cover all the permutations of the behavior, because system tests are so expensive to run. And also, that's not the point of system tests. The point of system tests is not to exercise every possible execution path through your code. The point is to make sure that everything works together. And so the place where I do try to cover every possible execution path through the code within reason is at the model test level, which again, you could call those unit tests. I'm not the kind of person to like take issue with that terminology as long as we know what we're talking about when we talk. That's how I do that. Anthony, does that answer your question a little bit better?
Yeah.
Okay. Sanjeev, maybe you had something to say?
No, what you said makes absolute sense in the sense that, end-to-end test has a certain scope, while the unit testing has a totally different scope. And, how, either of those can be done in an automated manner is something that I am yet to learn. So I cannot possibly comment on it. But I'm in agreement with what you said in terms of, the scope of each of those, what it will be.
Yeah, okay. Okay, great. Bishoy, any questions or comments for you? Or are you good?
All good till now. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, I usually keep these to about an hour, and we're coming up on about an hour. So maybe we can wrap it up soon. Question for you guys, another question for you guys. Is there anything that you would like to see in future sessions? I know, Anthony, you said GPT, and that's definitely something that I plan to cover in some future sessions. So you can take a look at the schedule. I'll be putting some of those up soon. But anything else you guys would like to see in future sessions?
For me, I think if someone planning from building or building a project from scratch, how to plan, like how to think about it. Like, okay, shall we like plan the UI, then the model, and then the relation between them, all of this? Or is there a way suggested to do this?
Yeah, okay. That's a great one. That's one I think about kind of a lot, actually. I'll make sure to plan a session for that. Bishoy, have you happened to have seen my podcast episode with Irina Nazarova, the first one I did? It's actually on that same topic.
Not yet, but I will check it.
Yeah, if you go to my podcast page on codewithjason.com, it's a fairly recent one. I did 2 episodes with her, I think. So go down to like, I believe it's the older one, or maybe it's the newer one. I don't know, but it's one of those with Irina Nazarova. Okay, any other ideas or any other ideas for future sessions from you guys? Okay.
So maybe, the
Yeah.
topic you were hoping to cover today, the different
Uh-huh.
way of thinking about Rails models. Maybe we can have a future, European one on that. Possibly?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, and I don't know if you happen to have seen Sanjeet, but I do have a video on YouTube of the USA session I did for that topic.
Okay. Let me watch that. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
One
Okay.
thing,
Mhm.
like it's something related to like very detailed in Rails, like how to manage the logic of UI. Is there like you suggest or have you discovered there is a method better than another, like helpers? Is it good to use it or no? And these kind of things, because I find myself, I write a lot of logic in helpers, but I see them as like it can be so messed, like a lot of them, a lot. It can like a lot of code in one file and not very organized.
Yeah, I know exactly what you mean. I think helpers have been very misunderstood, and people have. I think helpers have a very narrow use case, but people have used helpers very broadly, and they've used helpers in a way that doesn't really play to the strengths of helpers. That's kind of I touch on that in that talk on it's called A Different Way to Think About Rails Models, and again, you can find that one on YouTube. So feel free to watch that. But yeah, I think we'll do a European session on that one to give a chance to present it live and do Q&A and stuff like that. But yeah, for now you can find that same topic on YouTube. I would also recommend Bishoy. There's a video I have on YouTube on view component. I think the title is like what to do about complex view related logic or something like that. I'd recommend that one because that also speaks to your question about helpers.
Okay, I will check it. Thank you.
Okay. One last thing before we go, maybe two last things. I mentioned that I do consulting around some of these topics. If you go to codewithjason.com, there's a hire me link. So this is mainly for the YouTube audience. If you guys are interested in that, that's where you could go to learn more about that. And the other thing is I recently started a snail mail newsletter. I didn't know if anybody would be interested. Over 100 people from 20 different countries have signed up so far. I also have a link at codewithjason.com for my snail mail newsletter. So if that sounds interesting to you, dear viewer, you can go check that out too. Anyway, Anthony, Sanjit, Bishoy, thanks so much for attending, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Okay. Look
Thank you.
forward to that.
All right,
Talk
bye
later.
Thanks,
guys.
Jason.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Take care. Bye bye.